They called me a chatterbox, a liability. Too loud for special operations, they said. But when radio silence became our only chance of survival, I didn't speak for 72 hours straight. And what happened next changed everything they thought they knew about what it means to be invisible. When the extraction team finally found us, the first words out of their commander's mouth weren't about the mission success. They were about how someone who never shut up had just pulled off the quietest infiltration in unit history. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert heat in Nevada was already brutal at 600 hours, but inside the briefing tent at Nellis Air Force Base, the temperature felt even more suffocating. I sat in the back row of folding chairs, my notepad balanced on my knee, scribbling down every detail Major Harrison threw at us about the upcoming stealth training exercise. Around me, my fellow candidates sat in silence, most of them staring straight ahead with that 1,000-yard stare that special operations wannabes practice in the mirror. My pen scratched across the paper as I jotted down tactical notes, supply lists, contingency plans. I'd always been a note-taker, always asked follow-up questions, always wanted to understand not just the what, but the why behind every mission parameter. My instructors back in basic training had called it thoroughness. Here, at the Special Operations Assessment and Selection course, they had other words for it. Sergeant Martinez, Major Harrison's voice cut through the morning briefing like a blade through silk. You have something to add? I looked up from my notepad to find 30 pairs of eyes staring at me. I hadn't even realized I'd been whispering questions to myself while taking notes, a habit I'd developed during my 8 years in the regular Army. No, sir, just clarifying the extraction timeline in my notes. A few of the other candidates exchanged glances, the kind of looks that said, "Here we go again." I'd been getting those looks for 3 weeks now, ever since the assessment course began. Every time I asked for clarification on a drill, every time I talked through my thought process during problem-solving exercises, every time I did what had made me a successful intelligence analyst, but apparently made me a terrible candidate for stealth operations. "Martinez, see me after this briefing," Harrison said, his tone carrying that particular military flatness that meant you were about to receive some career-altering feedback. The rest of the briefing blurred past, something about a 72-hour field exercise starting at sunset, radio communications would be limited, teams of 4 would navigate hostile territory to reach designated objectives. Standard stuff, except for the part where our performance would determine who advanced to the next phase of selection and who got sent back to their regular units with a polite "thank you for trying." When the other candidates filed out, chatting in low voices about gear checks and strategy, I remained in my seat. Major Harrison approached with that measured gait of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of difficult conversations. 8 years active duty, he said, flipping through what I assumed was my personnel file. Intelligence specialist, 3 deployments, commendation for analytical work in Syria. Your technical scores are in the top 5% of candidates we've ever seen. I waited for the but that I knew was coming. But stealth operations require a different skill set, Martinez. When you're behind enemy lines, talking your way through a problem isn't an option. Sometimes the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure is measured in decibels. The words hit exactly where they were meant to. For weeks, I'd watched other candidates excel in the silent communication drills, while I struggled to break habits that had served me well in intelligence analysis, but made me stick out like a flare in tactical situations. "I can adapt, sir," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely sure I believed them. Harrison closed the file and looked at me directly. "Tonight's exercise will be your opportunity to prove that. Your team leaders specifically requested not to have you assigned to their units." The punch to my confidence was swift and precise. "Sir, they feel your communication style poses an operational risk in stealth scenarios." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I'm putting you with Team Delta, Staff Sergeant Coleman's group. They're short 1 person after Jackson medically dropped yesterday." I knew Coleman by reputation. 15 years special operations, including 4 years with Delta Force before becoming an instructor. He was the kind of soldier other soldiers told stories about in hushed tones. He was also known for having zero tolerance for what he called tactical chatter. This is your last chance to demonstrate you can operate within the parameters required for this program. 72 hours, limited communications, and, Martinez, he fixed me with a stare that seemed to see straight through whatever confidence I had left. I found Team Delta prepping their gear in a supply shed that smelled like gun oil and determination. Coleman looked up when I approached, his expression neutral but somehow conveying volumes about his expectations for my performance. "Martinez," he said by way of greeting, "you're replacing Jackson." The other two team members, Corporal Thompson and Private First Class Chen, nodded politely but without enthusiasm. I could practically hear their thoughts. Great, we got stuck with the chatterbox. "What's our objective?" I asked, pulling my own gear from my duffel bag. Coleman spread a topographic map across a makeshift table constructed from supply crates. "Infiltrate this compound," he pointed to a cluster of buildings marked in red ink, "extract intelligence package, exfiltrate without detection. Opposition force will be actively hunting us from hour 12 onward." I studied the terrain features, automatically starting to ask the questions that had become second nature. What's the estimated strength of the opposition? Do we have updated intelligence on patrol patterns? What's our fallback position if the primary extraction point is compromised? The silence that followed my rapid-fire inquiries was deafening. Thompson and Chad exchanged another one of those looks. Coleman just stared at me. "Martinez," Coleman said quietly, "in approximately 4 hours, we're going to insert into territory where asking questions out loud could get us all killed. I need to know right now if you can handle operating under complete radio silence." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about proving I belonged in special operations. This was about proving I could fundamentally change who I'd been as a soldier for the past 8 years. "I can do it," I said, though my voice carried more hope than certainty. Coleman studied my face for a long moment. "We'll see," he said finally. "Gear check in 30 minutes. We insert at sunset." As I laid out my equipment for inspection, I caught fragments of whispered conversation between Thompson and Chen. Words like liability and washout drifted over, not quite loud enough to be confrontational but clear enough to make their point. They'd already written me off before we'd even started. The thing about being underestimated is that it becomes a weight you carry everywhere. Not the motivating kind of weight that some people talk about, the chip on your shoulder that drives you to prove everyone wrong. This was different. This was the crushing weight of knowing that every mistake you made would be seen as confirmation of what everyone already believed about you. As the sun began its descent toward the Nevada horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, I made a decision that would define not just the next 72 hours, but the entire trajectory of my military career. I was going to go completely silent. Not just radio silent, which was standard protocol. Not just tactically quiet, which was expected. I was going to prove that someone they dismissed as too talkative could become completely invisible when it mattered most. What I didn't know as we prepared for insertion was that this exercise would become something far more serious than any of us had anticipated. What started as a training scenario was about to become a real-world crisis that would test every assumption the special operations community had about communication, leadership, and what it really means to be heard. The helicopter insertion went according to plan until it didn't. We were supposed to be dropped 12 kilometers from the target compound, giving us plenty of time to navigate under cover of darkness. Instead, our pilot's voice crackled through the headsets at 2147 hours with words that changed everything. Ground fire, taking evasive action." The aircraft bucked violently to the left, throwing me against Thompson's shoulder. Through the open door, I could see muzzle flashes dotting the landscape below like deadly fireflies. This wasn't part of the exercise. The opposition force wasn't supposed to have live ammunition, and they definitely weren't supposed to be engaging aircraft. Coleman's voice came through my headset, calm despite the chaos. "Hot LZ, we're going in early." The helicopter touched down hard in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, and we were out and running before the skids had fully settled. Behind us, the aircraft lifted off immediately into the night sky. We hit the ground in a tactical formation, weapons ready, scanning for threats that shouldn't have existed in a training scenario. That's when we heard it. Real gunfire, not the simulation rounds we'd expected.
Automatic weapons fire coming from multiple directions, and it was getting closer. Coleman raised his hand, signaling us to freeze. In the sudden silence, broken only by distant gunshots and the sound of our own breathing, he spoke in a whisper that barely carried 3 feet. "Radio's compromised. Unknown hostiles have infiltrated the exercise area. We're going full blackout." Thompson started to respond, but Coleman cut him off with a gesture. He pointed to his throat and shook his head. Complete silence from here on out. My heart hammered against my ribs as the reality of our situation settled in. This had stopped being a training exercise and become something far more dangerous. We were 12 kilometers from our original objective, in hostile territory, with no communication link to command and no way to call for extraction. Coleman gathered us in close, speaking in barely audible whispers. "Unknown force has turned this into a real-world situation. Our mission now is survival and evasion. We reach the compound, complete the original objective, and extract as planned, but we do it completely silent." He looked directly at me. "Martinez, this is what we talked about. No questions, no clarification, no tactical discussion. Hand signals only." I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. Everything I'd relied on as a soldier, every instinct to communicate and coordinate, would now be a liability that could get us all killed. We moved through the desert like ghosts, Coleman leading with the kind of silent precision that comes from years of real combat operations. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. Behind him, Thompson and Chen fell into a rhythm of soundless communication, using hand signals they'd perfected through countless training exercises. I brought up the rear, forcing myself to suppress every instinct to speak. When Chen stumbled slightly on loose rocks, I bit back the automatic "you okay" that rose to my lips. When Thompson paused to check his GPS, I stopped myself from asking about our route. When gunfire erupted closer than before, I swallowed the tactical questions that usually helped me process threatening situations. The silence was overwhelming.
Not just the absence of speech, but the hyper-awareness it created. Every sound became magnified. The whisper of fabric against fabric as we moved. The soft crunch of sand under our boots. The distant echo of voices that definitely didn't belong to any training cadre. 2 hours into our movement, Coleman held up a closed fist. We froze instantly, dropping into whatever cover the sparse desert vegetation provided. Through the darkness, I could make out figures moving across our path about 200 meters ahead. Not the clean, organized movement of American forces, but something more chaotic, more desperate. Coleman turned to face us, his expression grim even in the limited moonlight. He made a series of hand signals that roughly translated to "hostile forces, unknown numbers, alternative route required." This was where my training as an intelligence analyst should have kicked in, where I should have started asking the questions that would help us understand who we were dealing with and what they wanted. Instead, I forced myself to simply nod and follow as Coleman led us on a wide detour that added another hour to our movement. The compound appeared before us just as the eastern horizon began to show the first hint of dawn. It was supposed to be a simple training facility, a collection of prefabricated buildings surrounded by chain-link fence. Instead, we found ourselves looking at what appeared to be an active enemy position. Armed figures patrolled the perimeter. Vehicles that definitely weren't part of the exercise sat parked near the main building. And, most unsettling of all, we could see other figures moving around who were clearly bound, clearly captives. Coleman gathered us behind a low ridge that provided concealment. In the growing light, I could see the tension in his face as he processed what we were looking at. This had gone far beyond a compromised training exercise. We were witnessing what appeared to be an active hostage situation. He pulled out a small notepad and wrote quickly, then showed it to each of us. "Real hostiles. Real hostages. Mission continues. Extract intel package. Maintain silence." Thompson pointed to the captives and made questioning gestures. Coleman shook his head firmly and wrote again, "Not our mission. Intel package only."
Every fiber of my being wanted to argue, wanted to ask how we could ignore people who were clearly in danger, wanted to demand we call for backup, for a real rescue operation, for someone with more authority to make these decisions. But I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted blood and simply nodded. Coleman divided us into two teams. He and Chen would create a distraction on the far side of the compound. Thompson and I would infiltrate the main building and locate the intelligence package that was supposed to be hidden there as part of the original exercise. As we prepared to separate, Coleman wrote one final note and showed it to me specifically. 72 hours. Starts now. No sound until extraction. The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. 72 hours of complete silence while navigating a situation that had become genuinely life-threatening. No questions, no coordination, no ability to process the stress and fear through the verbal communication that had always been my coping mechanism. Thompson and I belly-crawled toward the compound's eastern fence as Coleman and Chen disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. The chain link was topped with razor wire, but there was a section where previous attackers in training scenarios had cut through. We slipped through the gap like shadows, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The main building was a simple rectangular structure, with windows too high to see through and a single door facing the compound center. Thompson checked his watch and held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes until Coleman's distraction would begin. As we waited, pressed against the building's eastern wall, I found myself studying Thompson's face in the growing light. He'd been one of the candidates who'd exchanged those dismissive looks about my communication habits. Now, in this moment of genuine danger, I could see something else in his expression. Fear, yes, but also a grudging recognition that maybe silence wasn't my weakness after all. The distraction came right on schedule. Explosions erupted from the far side of the compound, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Through the chaos, Thompson and I slipped around to the building's entrance. The door was unlocked, which should have been our first warning that something was wrong. We entered a corridor that smelled like stale cigarettes and unwashed bodies. The intelligence package was supposed to be hidden in an office at the building's far end, but as we moved deeper into the structure, we began to hear voices. American voices, speaking in the kind of rapid, stressed tones that suggested they weren't here voluntarily. Thompson stopped dead in the hallway, his eyes wide with the same realization that was hitting me. The hostages weren't random captives. They were American personnel, possibly other candidates from our own training program. He turned to me with an expression that asked a question his orders forbade him to speak. What do we do now? I looked back at him, and for the first time since beginning this exercise, I felt completely certain about something. I pointed toward the voices, then to myself, then made the hand signal for proceed. Thompson shook his head violently and pointed toward our original objective, the intelligence package, the mission we'd been given, the safe choice that would keep us out of a situation we weren't trained or equipped to handle. But I was already moving toward the sound of American voices, and after a moment's hesitation, Thompson followed. Because sometimes the most important communication isn't what you say, it's what you choose to do when speaking isn't an option. The voices led us to a storage room where we found them.
4 American soldiers, zip-tied and sitting against the far wall, their faces showing the kind of exhaustion that comes from hours of captivity. I recognized 2 of them from our own assessment course, candidates who'd been scheduled for a different training exercise that apparently had gone just as wrong as ours. Thompson froze in the doorway, his weapon raised but his expression uncertain. Our orders had been clear: retrieve the intelligence package and extract. Nothing about hostage rescue, nothing about engaging unknown hostile forces. Nothing about the kind of split-second decisions that could either save lives or get us all killed. But as I looked at those 4 faces, I realized something that would have taken me paragraphs to explain if I'd been allowed to speak. Sometimes the most important mission isn't the one you're given. It's the one that presents itself. I held up my hand to Thompson, then pointed to my watch and held up 10 fingers. 10 minutes.
He nodded, understanding that I was asking him to give me 10 minutes before we had to make a decision about proceeding with our original mission or attempting something far more dangerous. Moving with the kind of calculated silence that I'd never imagined I was capable of, I approached the nearest captive. Staff Sergeant Williams from the Advanced Reconnaissance Course. His eyes widened when he saw me, and he started to speak before I pressed my finger to my lips and shook my head firmly. I knelt beside him, pulling out my tactical knife to cut his restraints. The plastic zip ties parted with barely a whisper of sound. Williams rubbed his wrists and leaned close to my ear, his voice barely audible. 8 hostiles minimum, armed with AKs and sidearms. They've been moving people out every few hours. We're supposed to be next. I nodded, processing the tactical information while simultaneously planning our next move. The old me would have asked a dozen follow-up questions. How long had they been held? What did the hostiles want? Did Williams know anything about their organization or objectives? Instead, I simply moved to the next captive and began cutting their restraints. Thompson appeared at my shoulder, his expression conflicted. He pointed toward the door and made the hand signal for "Leave now." Our extraction window was approaching, and every minute we delayed increased the risk of discovery. But I'd made my decision. I pointed to the 4 soldiers we were freeing, then to Thompson and myself, then made the signal for "Move together." We were taking them with us. Thompson's eyes widened, and he began to gesture frantically. Too many people, too much noise, impossible to move 6 people silently through hostile territory. He was right about all of it, and under normal circumstances, I would have agreed with him. These weren't normal circumstances. I held up my hand and began using a combination of hand signals and quick sketches in the dust on the floor to outline a plan that was forming in my mind. It was the kind of complex tactical problem that had always required extensive verbal coordination in the past. Now I was reduced to drawings and gestures, but somehow that limitation was forcing me to think more clearly than I ever had before. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. We would split into 3 groups. Thompson would take 2 of the rescued soldiers and move toward the original extraction point using the route we'd planned. Williams would take the other rescued soldier and create a distraction to draw hostile attention away from the compound. I would remain behind to complete our original mission and retrieve the intelligence package, then rejoin the group at the extraction point. Thompson shook his head violently when I outlined my role. He pointed to himself, then to the intelligence package location, clearly volunteering to be the one who stayed behind. It was the logical choice. He had more tactical experience, better training for solo operations, and unlike me, he'd never been accused of being a liability in stealth situations. But I shook my head just as firmly. This was something I needed to do. Not to prove myself to Thompson or Coleman or Major Harrison, but to prove something to myself about who I could be when everything I'd relied on was stripped away. Williams had been watching our silent debate with growing understanding. He moved close to both of us and whispered, barely audible, "She's right. Analyst training. She knows what to look for in intel packages. And if this goes wrong, you'll need your best tactical operators with the main group." Thompson studied my face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. He understood what Williams understood. Sometimes the person who seems least qualified for a mission is actually the only one who can complete it. We synchronized our watches. 23 minutes until the extraction helicopter would arrive at the designated landing zone. Enough time for each phase of the plan if everything went perfectly. Not nearly enough margin for error if anything went wrong. Thompson led his group out first, moving with the practiced silence of soldiers who'd trained together for weeks. I watched them disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying with them my hope that at least some of us would make it out alive. Williams and his partner left 5 minutes later, heading toward the compound's western perimeter where they would create enough noise to draw attention away from my infiltration of the main building. As their footsteps faded, I found myself alone in hostile territory for the first time in my military career. The intelligence package was hidden in an office on the building's second floor, behind a false panel that would have been impossible to locate without the detailed briefing we'd received. I moved through the building like a ghost, every step calculated, every breath controlled. The kind of tactical movement that I'd struggled with for weeks during assessment was now flowing naturally, as if the enforced silence had unlocked something I'd never known I possessed. I found the office exactly where it was supposed to be, but as I located the hidden panel, I discovered something that changed everything. The intelligence package wasn't a training prop filled with dummy documents.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was real operational intelligence, containing what appeared to be detailed information about the hostile force that had infiltrated our training area. As I photographed the documents with my encrypted camera, pieces began falling into place. This wasn't a random attack on a military training exercise. It was a carefully planned operation by a group that had been monitoring American Special Operations training for months. The intelligence package contained their organizational structure, their funding sources, and most importantly, their plans for future operations against American facilities. The sound of footsteps in the corridor below interrupted my analysis. Multiple sets of boots moving with military precision toward the stairs. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the second floor, and the office had only one exit. This was the moment that would define not just the success of our mission, but potentially the safety of future training operations. I could try to escape with the intelligence, risking capture and the possibility that this critical information would never reach American forces. Or I could ensure the intelligence made it out, even if I didn't. I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of running, I activated the emergency beacon on my radio and began transmitting the photographed intelligence on an encrypted frequency that would reach every American base within 100 miles. It was a violation of radio silence that would certainly reveal my position, but it guaranteed that the information would reach the right people, regardless of what happened to me. The transmission took 47 seconds, long enough for the hostile forces to triangulate my position, long enough for them to surround the building, long enough to ensure that even if they captured me, the mission would be completed. As boots thundered up the stairs toward my position, I found myself thinking about Major Harrison's words about silence being survival. He'd been wrong about one thing. Sometimes survival isn't about staying hidden. Sometimes it's about making noise at exactly the right moment, even when everything you've been taught tells you to stay quiet. The office door burst open just as I finished destroying the physical intelligence package. 3 armed men entered, weapons raised, shouting commands in a language I didn't recognize. I raised my hand slowly, maintaining eye contact, projecting the kind of calm confidence that I'd never possessed during verbal confrontations, but somehow found natural in this moment of ultimate tactical crisis. They zip-tied my hands and pushed me toward the stairs, clearly planning to move me to wherever they were holding other captives. What they didn't know was that my 47 seconds of radio transmission had done more than just transmit intelligence. It had also included GPS coordinates, tactical assessments, and a detailed breakdown of hostile force strength and positioning. As they marched me through the compound, I could hear sounds in the distance that suggested the cavalry was coming. Helicopter rotors growing louder, the distinctive whine of military vehicles approaching at high speed, radio chatter in English coming from multiple directions. My transmission had worked. The intelligence was already being acted upon. 20 minutes later, when American Special Operations Forces stormed the compound in a precisely coordinated assault, they found me sitting calmly in the same storage room where we'd discovered the original hostages. Still zip-tied, still maintaining the radio silence that had become second nature, but no longer the soldier who'd been dismissed as too talkative for tactical operations. When they cut my restraints and the team leader asked if I was injured, I looked at him for a long moment before answering. The first words I'd spoken in over 60 hours. "Mission accomplished, sir. Intelligence package transmitted and confirmed received." Later, during the debrief that followed, Major Harrison would tell me that my transmission had provided the most comprehensive tactical intelligence package in the history of the assessment program. That the information I'd gathered and transmitted had led to the arrest of a network that had been planning attacks on 3 other military installations. But what he said next surprised me more than any commendation or recognition ever could. "Martinez," he said, looking directly at me across the debriefing table, "you spent 63 hours in complete radio silence, completed a mission that had escalated far beyond its original parameters, and managed tactical coordination that most operators couldn't handle with full communication capabilities." He paused, consulting his notes. "I've recommended you for immediate advancement to the next phase of selection." "Sir?" I managed, still processing the events of the past 3 days. "Turns out, the most important communication skill for special operations isn't knowing when to talk," he said, with something that might have been a smile. "It's knowing when not to." 6 months later, I graduated from the Special Operations program with the highest tactical scores in my class. But more importantly, I'd learned something about myself that would define the rest of my military career. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in what you say, but in what you choose not to say, and when you choose to break that silence, you'd better make sure it matters. The chatterbox they'd written off had become the operator who knew exactly when words were necessary and when action spoke louder than any amount of tactical discussion ever could. The video surfaced 3 weeks after the operation, posted anonymously on a military forum that specialized in leaked training footage. Someone had been recording with their phone during the initial briefing at Nellis, capturing the moment when Major Harrison called me out for taking too many notes, for asking too many questions, for being the kind of soldier who couldn't keep quiet when the situation demanded silence. The footage was grainy, shot from the back of the briefing tent, but you could clearly hear Harrison's voice cutting through the morning air. "Sergeant Martinez, you have something to add?" The camera caught my response, my defensive explanation about clarifying timelines, and the collective eye-rolling from my fellow candidates. What made the video extraordinary wasn't that moment of criticism. It was what the anonymous poster had added to it. Official military communications from the actual operation. Radio transmissions of my intelligence dump during those crucial 40-second seconds when I broke silence. The precise tactical coordinates, the organizational breakdown of the hostile network, the real-time battlefield intelligence that had led to one of the most successful counterterrorism operations on American soil in recent memory. The contrast was stark and powerful. The soldier being dismissed for talking too much, followed immediately by her voice providing the kind of tactical communication that saves lives and prevents attacks. The post went viral within military circles before spreading to civilian social media, where it sparked conversations about assumptions, leadership, and what real tactical competence actually looks like. I tried to ignore the attention. Special operations personnel don't typically become internet celebrities, and the whole situation felt uncomfortably close to violating operational security. But the story had taken on a life of its own, and within days I was receiving messages from soldiers I'd never met sharing their own experiences of being underestimated or dismissed. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing intelligence reports at my new assignment with Joint Special Operations Command. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unexpected. "Sergeant Martinez, this is Colonel Patricia Vance, Director of Special Operations Training and Doctrine. I've been following your recent operational performance and the subsequent discussion it's generated within the community." I straightened in my chair, though she couldn't see me.
Colonel Vance was a legend in special operations circles, one of the first women to complete the most elite training programs and someone whose tactical innovations had become standard protocol across all branches. "Ma'am," I managed, still processing why someone at her level would be calling me directly. "I'm putting together a task force to review and revise our selection and training protocols. Recent events have highlighted some significant gaps in how we evaluate tactical communication skills and operational judgment." Her pause was precisely timed. "I want you to lead the assessment team." The offer hit me like a physical blow. lead a task force that would essentially review the same system that had nearly eliminated me from consideration, work with the instructors and administrators who had spent weeks questioning whether I belonged in special operations at all. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to evaluate training protocols for programs I've barely completed myself. Martinez. Colonel Vance's voice carried the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions under pressure. The most qualified person to fix a broken system is often someone who's experienced its failures firsthand. Your operational record speaks for itself, but more importantly, you understand both sides of the communication equation, when to speak and when to stay silent. 3 weeks later, I found myself back at Nellis Air Force Base, but this time walking into the same briefing tent where I'd been criticized for asking too many questions. The difference was profound. Instead of sitting in the back row taking notes while being dismissed, I was standing at the front of the room addressing an audience of instructors, program administrators, and senior military officials. Major Harrison was in the third row, his expression unreadable as I began my presentation on tactical communication assessment. The same man who had told me that silence was survival was now listening to me explain why that philosophy, while important, was incomplete. Traditional special operations training has emphasized the ability to operate without verbal communication, I began, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. This skill remains critically important. However, recent operational analysis suggests we may be conflating different types of communication skills and inadvertently selecting against personnel who possess equally valuable tactical abilities. I clicked to the next slide, which showed statistical breakdowns of mission success rates correlated with different communication styles among operators. The data told a story that challenged conventional wisdom about what made an effective special operations soldier. Personnel who demonstrate high verbal processing skills during selection often become the most effective field intelligence analysts and tactical coordinators in complex operations. The challenge isn't eliminating these individuals from programs, but rather teaching them when and how to modulate their communication style based on operational requirements. From the audience, I could see nodding heads and thoughtful expressions. These were professionals who understood that tactical effectiveness couldn't be reduced to simple formulas about staying quiet. Colonel Vance stood up from her seat in the front row. Sergeant Martinez, can you speak to specific training modifications that might address these issues? This was the moment I'd been preparing for since accepting the assignment. The opportunity to propose changes that could prevent other soldiers from experiencing the kind of systematic dismissal I'd faced. 3 primary modifications, ma'am. First, we implement tiered communication protocols that teach candidates when different communication styles are tactically appropriate. Radio silence for stealth infiltration, verbal coordination for complex multi-team operations, and precise tactical broadcasting for time-critical intelligence sharing. I clicked to a detailed training timeline. Second, we modify evaluation criteria to assess communication effectiveness rather than communication volume. Some of our most successful operators are those who can switch between silence and comprehensive tactical discussion based on situational requirements. The third slide showed proposed changes to instructor training. Finally, we provide specialized training for assessment personnel to recognize the difference between nervous chatter and tactical processing. Many candidates who appear overly talkative are actually demonstrating advanced analytical skills that become crucial in real-world operations. Major Harrison raised his hand, and I nodded for him to speak. Sergeant, these modifications sound comprehensive in theory, but how do we maintain the selection standards that ensure only the most capable personnel advance to operational status? It was a fair question, and one I'd anticipated. Sir, we maintain rigorous standards while expanding our definition of tactical capability. The candidate who asks detailed questions during briefings may be the same person who provides life-saving intelligence coordination during actual operations. We need selection processes that can identify and develop both skill sets. After the presentation, Harrison approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Martinez, I owe you an apology. When I told you that silence was survival, I was applying a narrow tactical principle to a much broader operational challenge.
I studied his face, seeing something I hadn't expected, genuine respect mixed with what might have been regret. You were teaching what your experience had shown you, sir, but experience in one context doesn't always translate to different operational environments. The changes you're proposing, he continued, they're going to require instructors to fundamentally rethink how we evaluate candidates. Some of us have been doing this the same way for years. Change is hard, I agreed, but so is losing potentially excellent operators because we can't see past our preconceptions about what tactical competence looks like. 6 months later, the new protocols were implemented across all special operations training programs. The Modified Tactical Communication Assessment, as it became known, evaluated candidates across multiple communication scenarios rather than emphasizing a single operational mode. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Completion rates increased by 18%, but more importantly, operational effectiveness scores for graduating classes showed significant improvement in complex, multifaceted missions that required diverse skill sets. I received updates from instructors across different bases, describing candidates who might have been eliminated under previous protocols, but who were now excelling in specialized roles that matched their communication strengths. Intelligence specialists who could coordinate complex information gathering, tactical coordinators who could manage multi-team operations, field analysts who could process and transmit critical data under pressure. But the most meaningful feedback came from an unexpected source. Corporal Thompson, my teammate from that original exercise, had completed the advanced program and was now serving with an elite unit specializing in hostage rescue operations. His message was brief but impactful. Martinez, wanted you to know we just completed a mission that required exactly the kind of complex coordination you were trying to discuss during selection. The operator who managed the tactical communications was someone who would have been eliminated under the old protocols. Mission success, all hostages recovered, no casualties. The quiet ones aren't always the most effective ones. Standing in my office at the Pentagon, where I now worked as a tactical doctrine analyst, I looked out at the bustling activity of military personnel going about their daily responsibilities. Each person represented a different approach to service, different strengths, different ways of contributing to mission success. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Colonel Vance's voice was as crisp as ever. Martinez, we're expanding the communication protocol review to joint international training exercises.
I need someone who understands that tactical effectiveness isn't about fitting a single mold. I smiled, remembering the briefing tent where I'd been criticized for asking too many questions. Ma'am, when do we start? Because the most important lesson I'd learned wasn't about when to speak or when to stay silent. It was about recognizing that different missions require different kinds of communication. And the most effective military is one that can harness all types of tactical intelligence, whether it comes through carefully planned silence or precisely timed words. The soldier they'd called too talkative had become the person responsible for ensuring that future generations of operators would be evaluated for what they could contribute, not dismissed for how they communicated. And sometimes that change in perspective makes all the difference between a good military and an exceptional one. The emergency call came at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning, pulling me from the kind of deep sleep that comes after 18-hour days spent reviewing tactical protocols and preparing briefings for congressional defense committees. The voice on the secure line was General Rebecca Morrison, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the tension in her tone immediately told me this wasn't a routine consultation about training procedures. Martinez, we have a situation developing in Eastern Europe that requires immediate tactical assessment. How quickly can you be at Andrews Air Force Base? I was already reaching for my go bag before she finished the question. 3 years of working in tactical doctrine development had taught me that when flag officers call before dawn, the situation is either catastrophic or about to become catastrophic. 40 minutes, ma'am, I replied, pulling on the same combat boots I'd worn during that life-changing exercise at Nellis. Some habits, some pieces of equipment become part of who you are rather than what you carry. Briefing packet will be waiting on the aircraft. Martinez, General Morrison paused, and I could hear the weight of command in that silence. This one's going to test everything we've learned about communication protocols in the field.
The flight to Ramstein Air Base in Germany took 8 hours, during which I absorbed the most complex tactical briefing I'd encountered since joining the doctrine development team. A joint NATO training exercise in Poland had been compromised by what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to test Western response capabilities and communication security. 12 special operations personnel from 4 different countries were currently trapped behind simulated enemy lines that had become genuinely hostile territory. The exercise had been infiltrated by an unknown force using advanced electronic warfare capabilities that had effectively severed all traditional communication links between the trapped operators and their command structures. What made the situation particularly challenging was the international nature of the trapped team. American, British, German, and Polish operators who had trained together for weeks but who were now operating under different national command authorities with conflicting protocols for handling compromised exercises. The briefing materials included detailed psychological profiles of each trapped operator, and as I reviewed them during the flight, a pattern emerged that seemed almost designed to test the communication protocol modifications we'd implemented over the past 3 years. The team included personnel who represented the entire spectrum of tactical communication styles, from operators who excelled in silent coordination to others whose strength lay in complex verbal processing and coordination. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, the American team leader, was someone whose tactical profile reminded me strongly of my own experience during selection. High analytical intelligence, tendency toward detailed verbal coordination, history of being criticized for over-communication during traditional stealth exercises. Under the old evaluation protocols, he might never have advanced to team leadership positions. British Special Air Service operative Lieutenant Sarah Williams specialized in multi-team coordination and had developed innovative hand signal systems that allowed for complex tactical discussions without verbal communication. Her strength was in creating communication systems that worked across language barriers and cultural differences. German Kommando Spezialkraft operator Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Müller was known for his ability to maintain operational effectiveness during extended periods of radio silence. But his psychological profile indicated that his analytical processing relied heavily on verbal discussion and confirmation with team members. Polish Grom operator Sergeant First Class Anna Kowalski had expertise in electronic warfare countermeasures, but was considered by some instructors to ask too many technical questions during briefings, a trait that had nearly prevented her advancement to elite units. Looking at these profiles, I realized that whoever had designed this operation understood exactly what they were doing. They had created a scenario that would test not just individual operator capabilities, but the fundamental assumptions about tactical communication that military forces had been operating under for decades. The aircraft touched down at Ramstein just as European dawn was breaking across the German countryside. I was met by a joint task force that included representatives from all 4 affected nations, but the tension in the briefing room was immediately apparent. Each national contingent was advocating for different approaches to resolving the crisis, and the lack of unified command structure was creating exactly the kind of coordination paralysis that effective communication protocols are designed to prevent. Colonel James Patterson, the American contingent commander, outlined the situation with the kind of military precision that masked significant underlying concern. Martinez, we have 12 operators who've been without communication for 14 hours. Traditional extraction protocols aren't viable due to the electronic warfare environment. We need innovative solutions. British Colonel Margaret Thornton interrupted with barely concealed frustration. What we need is decisive action. Our people are trained to operate independently. We extract them using proven silent infiltration techniques. German Oberst Heinrich Richter shook his head firmly. The electronic warfare capabilities suggest this is a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. Rushing in with traditional techniques could compromise future NATO exercises and provide valuable intelligence to hostile forces. Polish Colonel Andrzej Nowak added another layer of complexity. Our technical analysis indicates that the electronic warfare systems are specifically designed to test communication protocols. This isn't just about extraction. Someone wants to understand how we coordinate under pressure. As I listened to this discussion, I recognized a familiar pattern. Four experienced military leaders, each advocating for approaches based on their national training doctrines and cultural assumptions about tactical communication. Each approach had merit, but the lack of unified strategy was creating exactly the kind of decision paralysis that could turn a manageable crisis into a genuine catastrophe. Colonels, I said, standing up with the kind of confidence that 3 years of doctrine development had taught me to project, may I suggest that we're approaching this from the wrong direction? The room fell silent, and I could feel the weight of senior officer attention focusing on me. This was the moment when everything I'd learned about tactical communication, both in the field and in conference rooms, would either provide a solution or demonstrate the limitations of theoretical knowledge. Instead of debating which national doctrine provides the best approach, we should be asking what combination of communication capabilities our trapped operators possess and how we can leverage those capabilities to resolve the situation themselves. I moved to the tactical display showing the operational area. Staff Sergeant Chen has demonstrated exceptional analytical coordination abilities. Lieutenant Williams has developed cross-cultural communication systems. Hauptfeldwebel Mueller excels at silent operation, but processes complex information verbally. Sergeant Kowalski understands electronic warfare countermeasures, but was considered by some instructors to ask too many technical questions during briefings, a trait that had nearly prevented her advancement to elite units. Looking at these profiles, I realized that whoever had designed this operation understood exactly what they were doing. They had created a scenario that would test not just individual operator capabilities, but the fundamental assumptions about tactical communication that military forces had been operating under for decades. The aircraft touched down at Ramstein just as European dawn was breaking across the German countryside. I was met by a joint task force that included representatives from all four affected nations, but the tension in the briefing room was immediately apparent. Each national contingent was advocating for different approaches to resolving the crisis, and the lack of unified command structure was creating exactly the kind of coordination paralysis that effective communication protocols are designed to prevent. Colonel James Patterson, the American contingent commander, outlined the situation with the kind of military precision that masked significant underlying concern. Martinez, we have 12 operators who've been without communication for 14 hours. Traditional extraction protocols aren't viable due to the electronic warfare environment. We need innovative solutions. British Colonel Margaret Thornton interrupted with barely concealed frustration. What we need is decisive action. Our people are trained to operate independently. We extract them using proven silent infiltration techniques. German Oberst Heinrich Richter shook his head firmly. The electronic warfare capabilities suggest this is a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. Rushing in with traditional techniques could compromise future NATO exercises and provide valuable intelligence to hostile forces. Polish Colonel Andrzej Nowak added another layer of complexity. Our technical analysis indicates that the electronic warfare systems are specifically designed to test communication protocols. This isn't just about extraction. Someone wants to understand how we coordinate under pressure. As I listened to this discussion, I recognized a familiar pattern. Four experienced military leaders, each advocating for approaches based on their national training doctrines and cultural assumptions about tactical communication. Each approach had merit, but the lack of unified strategy was creating exactly the kind of decision paralysis that could turn a manageable crisis into a genuine catastrophe.
We would use a series of precisely timed environmental signals visible from the operator's position to provide them with tactical intelligence about their situation. Helicopter overflights at specific times would indicate safe extraction routes. Ground vehicle movements would signal the location of hostile forces. Even the timing of aircraft contrails across the sky could convey tactical information to operators trained to recognize such patterns. But the key element of the plan involved something that traditional military doctrine rarely considers: leveraging the different communication strengths of each trapped operator to create a collaborative solution that none of them could achieve individually. German Oberst Richter was the first to understand the implications. You're creating a scenario where they must combine their different tactical communication capabilities to succeed. Exactly, I confirmed. Chen's analytical processing, Williams' cross-cultural coordination, Mueller's silent operation capabilities, and Kowalski's technical countermeasures expertise. Separately, each operator has limitations. Combined, they represent a comprehensive tactical communication system. The implementation of the plan required 12 hours of precise coordination between multiple command centers, but as evening approached over the Polish countryside, we began receiving confirmation that our environmental signals were being recognized and processed by the trapped operators. The first indication of success came through satellite surveillance showing movement patterns that indicated the operators had not only received our intelligence, but were coordinating among themselves using techniques that wouldn't be visible to electronic surveillance systems. Staff Sergeant Chen had apparently taken point on tactical analysis, using his detailed processing capabilities to interpret the environmental signals and develop a comprehensive understanding of their tactical situation. Lieutenant Williams was coordinating movement between team members using the hand signal systems she'd developed, enabling complex tactical discussion without verbal communication that could be monitored. Hauptfeldwebel Mueller was leading the actual infiltration movement, using his silent operation expertise to navigate the team through hostile territory without detection. Sergeant Kowalski was providing real-time assessment of electronic countermeasures, ensuring that their movement wouldn't trigger surveillance systems they couldn't detect. But what made their coordination remarkable wasn't just the individual capabilities each operator brought to the situation. It was how they had adapted their communication styles to create a collaborative system that was more effective than traditional radio-coordinated operations. The satellite feeds showed them moving through hostile territory with the kind of precision that comes from perfect tactical communication, but using methods that were essentially invisible to the electronic warfare systems designed to monitor and disrupt military coordination. At 2:14 hours, exactly 18 hours after losing communication with command, all 12 operators appeared at the designated extraction point. They had not only successfully evaded capture, but had gathered comprehensive information about the electronic warfare capabilities that had compromised their original exercise. The debriefing session that followed provided insights that would influence NATO tactical doctrine for years to come. Each operator described how they had adapted their individual communication strengths to contribute to collective problem-solving that wouldn't have been possible using traditional protocols. Staff Sergeant Chen's report was particularly revealing. "Ma'am, the environmental signaling system worked because it required us to combine different types of tactical processing. I could analyze the information, but I needed Williams' coordination systems to share that analysis with the team without verbal communication. Mueller's silent movement capabilities got us where we needed to go, but Kowalski's technical expertise kept us from triggering surveillance systems we couldn't see." Lieutenant Williams added another crucial insight. The most important factor wasn't any individual capability. It was learning to trust that each team member would contribute their strengths without trying to control the entire operation. Traditional communication protocols often create dependency on single coordination sources. This situation required distributed leadership. Hauptfeldwebel Mueller's perspective highlighted something that wouldn't have been apparent from traditional tactical analysis. Silent operation isn't just about making no noise. It's about creating communication systems that work outside conventional detection methods. Hand signals, movement patterns, environmental awareness. We were constantly communicating, just not in ways that electronic systems could monitor. Sergeant Kowalski's technical assessment provided the strategic insight that made this operation significant beyond just a successful extraction. The electronic warfare systems were designed to disrupt radio and digital communication, but they weren't configured to interfere with adaptive human communication. Whoever designed this test understood conventional military communication but underestimated tactical adaptivity. As I compiled the after-action report during the flight back to Washington, I realized that this operation had demonstrated something fundamental about tactical communication that went far beyond military applications. Effective communication isn't about having perfect systems that work under ideal conditions. It's about having adaptive capabilities that can function when traditional systems fail.
The operators had succeeded not because they had superior technology or overwhelming force, but because they had learned to combine different communication strengths in ways that created resilience against systematic disruption. Chen's analytical processing, Williams' coordination systems, Mueller's silent operation, and Kowalski's technical countermeasures had become components of a communication network that was more robust than any single approach. Back in Washington, the implications of the operation became the subject of intense discussion among military leadership and defense policy analysts. The ability to maintain tactical effectiveness despite comprehensive electronic warfare interference had strategic importance that extended far beyond special operations. General Morrison called me into her office 3 days after the mission debrief. "Martinez, the success of this operation has raised questions at the highest levels of government about how we approach tactical communication training and doctrine development." I sat across from her desk, which was covered with reports from defense contractors, academic institutions, and military training commands, all apparently related to communication protocol development. The operators succeeded because they could adapt their communication styles to circumstances that traditional training hadn't anticipated, she continued. But more importantly, they succeeded because they had learned to value different types of tactical intelligence rather than trying to force everyone into the same operational mold. She pulled out a folder marked with classification levels I wasn't accustomed to seeing. "We're establishing a new department within Joint Special Operations Command focused on adaptive tactical communication. Cross-cultural communication systems, multi-spectrum communication systems, resilience against electronic warfare. I want you to head the program." The magnitude of what she was proposing took a moment to process. Leading a department that would essentially institutionalize the lessons learned from my own experience of being dismissed for communication style, then proving that different approaches could be tactically superior under different circumstances. "Ma'am, this would be developing doctrine that challenges fundamental assumptions about military communication that have been in place for decades." "Exactly," General Morrison replied with the kind of smile that indicated she understood both the opportunity and the challenge. "The Polish operation demonstrated that our traditional approaches to tactical communication may be creating vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries can exploit. We need personnel who understand both the strengths and limitations of conventional doctrine." 6 months later, the Adaptive Tactical Communication Department had become one of the most requested training programs in the military. Officers from every branch were applying for positions that would teach them to recognize and develop communication capabilities that went beyond traditional radio protocol and command structure coordination. The program attracted personnel who represented every point on the tactical communication spectrum. Silent operators who wanted to understand how verbal coordination could enhance their effectiveness. Analytical coordinators who wanted to develop capabilities that would function without electronic support. Technical specialists who wanted to understand how human communication could serve as backup for technological systems. But the most rewarding aspect of the program was working with personnel who had experienced their own versions of being dismissed for communication styles that didn't fit conventional expectations. Soldiers who had been told they asked too many questions. Operators who had been criticized for processing information verbally. Analysts who had been considered too talkative for field operations. Staff Sergeant Chen became one of the program's first instructors, teaching courses on analytical coordination that helped students understand how detailed verbal processing could be converted into tactical advantages. His classes became some of the most popular in the program, partly because he could speak from personal experience about overcoming assumptions about communication style. Lieutenant Williams developed a curriculum focused on cross-cultural communication that became required training for all international joint operations. Her work on hand signal systems that could convey complex tactical information across language barriers became standard protocol for NATO exercises. Hauptfeldwebel Mueller was leading the actual infiltration movement, using his silent operation expertise to navigate the team through hostile territory without detection. Sergeant Kowalski was providing real-time assessment of electronic countermeasures, ensuring that their movement wouldn't trigger surveillance systems they couldn't detect. But what made their coordination remarkable wasn't just the individual capabilities each operator brought to the situation. It was how they had adapted their communication styles to create a collaborative system that was more effective than traditional radio-coordinated operations. The satellite feeds showed them moving through hostile territory with the kind of precision.
Hauptfeldwebel-Müller created training modules that taught students how to maintain tactical effectiveness during extended communication blackouts, but his approach emphasized preparation and coordination rather than simply enduring isolation. Sergeant Kowalski developed countermeasures training that prepared operators to maintain communication capability despite electronic warfare interference, but her courses focused on adaptive human communication rather than just technological solutions. The success of the program began attracting attention from unexpected sources. Corporate leadership development programs wanted to understand how military tactical communication could be applied to business coordination challenges. Academic institutions began studying the program as an example of how organizations could leverage diverse communication styles rather than enforcing conformity. But the most meaningful validation came from operational results. Units that had completed the adaptive communication training showed consistently higher mission success rates, particularly in complex operations that required coordination between different specialties or across cultural boundaries. The annual review meeting took place in the same Pentagon conference room where I'd first briefed senior leadership on communication protocol modifications 3 years earlier. General Morrison presided over a presentation that included statistics, case studies, and testimonials from commanders whose units had completed the training. "Martinez," she said as the formal presentation concluded, "when we first discussed modifying tactical communication protocols, I wasn't entirely certain whether we were addressing a real capability gap or just accommodating personnel who couldn't adapt to traditional requirements." The conference room fell silent as senior officers from every branch waited for her assessment. "The operational results speak for themselves," she continued, gesturing toward the statistical summaries displayed on the main screen. "Units trained in adaptive communication protocols show 18% higher mission success rates, 23% better performance in joint operations, and 31% improved effectiveness in electronic warfare environments." She turns to address the full assembly. But the most significant finding isn't statistical, it's strategic. Military forces that can maintain tactical effectiveness despite communication system compromise have fundamental advantages over forces that depend on technological solutions alone. Colonel Patterson, who had been present during the original Polish crisis, raised his hand. "General, how do we scale these capabilities across conventional forces without compromising the specialized training that makes special operations effective?" It was a question I'd been anticipating since the program began showing success. How do you maintain elite capability while making training accessible to broader military populations? "Sir," I replied, standing to address the assembly, "the goal isn't to make every soldier a special operations expert. It's to ensure that every soldier understands how their individual communication strengths can contribute to collective tactical effectiveness." I clicked to a presentation slide that showed training timelines adapted for different military specialties. A logistics coordinator doesn't need to master silent infiltration techniques, but they benefit from understanding how their analytical communication style can support operations that require precision coordination. An infantry soldier doesn't need to become an electronic warfare expert, but they benefit from understanding how to maintain tactical communication when technological systems fail. The questions that followed demonstrated both the enthusiasm and the skepticism that innovative military programs typically encounter. Officers who had seen the operational benefits wanted to implement the training immediately. Others worried about maintaining traditional standards and capabilities that had proven effective over decades of military operations. General Morrison allowed the discussion to continue for over an hour before calling for final comments. "This program represents something more significant than tactical innovation," she said, looking around the conference room. "It represents institutional recognition that military effectiveness comes from leveraging human capabilities rather than forcing human adaptation to technological requirements." Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades watching military doctrine evolve in response to changing strategic challenges.
The soldier who was criticized for asking too many questions may be the person who prevents intelligence failures. The operator who was considered too talkative for stealth missions may be the one who coordinates successful multi-team operations. Our responsibility is to recognize and develop these capabilities rather than dismissing them. As the meeting concluded and officers filed out discussing implementation timelines and resource requirements, I remained seated, thinking about the path that had led from a training exercise where I'd been criticized for communication style to a conference room where that same communication style was being institutionalized as military doctrine. The transformation hadn't been just personal, it had been systemic. An entire military structure had learned to recognize that tactical effectiveness could come from different approaches to communication rather than conformity to single operational models. 6 months later, I received a message that brought the entire journey full circle. It was from a second lieutenant who had just completed basic officer training and was requesting assignment to a special operations preparation program. Colonel Martinez, the message read, I wanted to thank you for the adaptive communication protocols that are now part of standard military training. During my evaluation, instructors noted that I tend to process tactical problems verbally and ask detailed questions during briefings. Under previous protocols, this might have been considered a limitation. Instead, I was identified as someone whose communication style could be valuable for analytical coordination roles. The message continued with details about the lieutenant's background and training objectives, but what struck me most was the confidence in her tone. She wasn't asking for accommodation or special consideration. She was describing communication capabilities that were now recognized as tactical assets rather than limitations to be overcome. I understand that you were instrumental in developing training that helps military personnel leverage their communication strengths rather than hiding them, she concluded. I hope to contribute to operations that require the kind of adaptive coordination that your program has made possible. Reading that message in my Pentagon office, looking out at the bustling activity of military personnel representing every branch and specialty, I realized that the most important victory hadn't been the successful operations or the statistical improvements in mission effectiveness. The most important victory was that future generations of military personnel would be evaluated for what they could contribute rather than dismissed for how they communicated. That soldiers who asked questions would be valued for their analytical capabilities, that operators who processed information verbally would be recognized for their coordination strengths, that personnel who couldn't conform to traditional silent operation models would still find ways to serve effectively in roles that matched their capabilities. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. General Morrison's voice was as crisp as ever, but I could hear satisfaction in her tone. Martinez, we just received approval for international expansion of the adaptive communication program. NATO wants to implement the training across all member nations. Additionally, we're getting requests from civilian emergency response organizations who want to understand how military tactical communication can be applied to disaster coordination. I smiled, thinking about Staff Sergeant Chen and Lieutenant Williams and all the other personnel who had proven that effective communication comes in many forms. When do we start, ma'am? Immediately, she replied, because the most important lesson we've learned is that tactical effectiveness isn't about having the right answer. It's about having the right people who can find answers using whatever communication capabilities the situation requires. As I prepared for another expansion of a program that had grown from personal experience into institutional change, I reflected on something that would have surprised the soldier who had been criticized for asking too many questions during a training exercise years earlier. Sometimes the most important service you can provide isn't following orders perfectly. Sometimes it's demonstrating that there are different ways to achieve mission success, and that military effectiveness comes from leveraging human diversity rather than enforcing conformity. The soldier they had called too talkative had become the person responsible for ensuring that communication itself was understood as a tactical capability that could be developed, adapted, and applied in ways that strengthened rather than compromised operational effectiveness. And in a world where strategic challenges require innovative solutions, that transformation from individual success to institutional change represents the kind of military evolution that enhances national security by maximizing human potential rather than limiting it to traditional operational models. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.